Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. On today's episode, we bring you the recording of the event that we hosted on Monday, July 21st. It was called Solidarity Against Tyranny, and it brought together organizers and frontline activists from the Appalachian South and elsewhere in the United States, as well as the Philippines, to discuss the challenges that our movements are facing, the new repressive political situation we find ourselves in, that in many cases is not so new, the violence that our movements are facing, restrictions on free speech, challenges to the rights to public protest, the forms of pushback that we're facing from governments, from vigilantes, and from corporations. It was a fantastic event, very powerful, and if you didn't make it live, that's why we want to bring you this recording. The video version of this podcast is also available on our YouTube channel. If you're listening to this on Substack, you can see that video embedded in the post below, and we really hope that you enjoy this. If folks want to support the organizations that were part of this event, we're running a fundraiser that's open until August 15th. Donations to that fundraiser will get split evenly between the organizations participating in this event. That's with the exception of Ideals. They declined to accept donations very graciously. So these organizations need your support. We need your support. And we look forward to building on this event and continuing to bring you more news, information, analysis, strategy, and tools that you can use to become more effective from the front lines. Thank you. And without further ado, here's that recording.
Hello, everybody. We just opened up the virtual doors here, so we'll give people a few minutes, or moments, I should say, to get all logged on. Sometimes it takes a second or two. So welcome. Thanks for your patience. We were also working on some technical side of things with other live broadcasts of this event besides the Zoom gathering here. So I think we have everything in order on a couple other platforms, I believe YouTube, as well as Facebook through CELDF, which is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. So for those where that platform is easier, you can join the event through those platforms. So from what I can tell, we've got folks joining us. There may be a few others coming. When they do, we'll let them in, of course, when they arrive. But I think we will get things going. I should say both good evening and good morning. We have sort of obviously very global presence here, which has us dabbling in different time zones. So in fact, not just time, but also days. For the folks from the Philippines, we're into the next day already. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Kai Hushka. I am the executive director for the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. We say CELDF for short. I will be the host for the event here. We titled this event, for those who didn't track it closely, as Solidarity Against Tyranny, Frontline Resistance Insights from the Philippines and Appalachian South. As one who has been tracking these things or actively involved in various justice fights, of course, there's probably no shortage of stories we could be telling from all over the globe. And clearly, if we had multiple lifetimes, it would be very interesting and fascinating and worthy to hear all those stories. But we think what we have done here tonight is assemble a pretty amazing panel of people together to talk really about what has been happening in that fight for justice in the Philippines and the Appalachian South, for those folks to share, to inform, and ideally to inspire, despite all the barriers, the challenges, the awful things currently and historically that have taken place in both those regions of the world. I think ultimately it should be about inspiration and confidence building, is what we hope people will take away from today. We've asked our guests here to bring in those stories again of the recent past, of the deeper past, of things that are currently happening. all unfortunately under the name of very brutal and oppressive governmental actions, and in a lot of cases, non-governmental actions. What does that look like when you're trying to do in plain English, the right thing? The Philippines and the Appalachian South, of course, are no strangers to colonialism, to gangster capitalism, to imperialism. It's unfortunately alive and well, despite valiant efforts from the people gathered here today and others. But again, within all that, we think there is a lot to learn, a lot to take away with from tonight's and this morning's gathering about how you deal with that, how you stay strong, how you move ahead, and as the title indicates, how you stay in solidarity, whether it's the solidarity within your local communities, whether it's solidarity across the globe. Coming together in these ways is very important, especially when you're fighting against systems that were intentionally built on faulty foundations. So this is what we're reeling from. This is what we're contending with. And of course, within that, there's a lot of chaos, and there's more chaos to come. Unfortunately, a lot of chaos, and some of that chaos is unfortunately very violent. Loss of life is part of that. But also within that, and I think our panelists would agree, is there is opportunity of friendships, relationships, companionship, and actually the viability of transformative change. And I think that is, again, another key thing that we hope will come from it. Those details, the characters, the stories, the uplifting moments, those are for our guests to share. So in a few moments, we'll get into hearing about what it means, what it looks like on the ground in the Philippines and in the Appalachian South of the United States. We have invited people from all over the globe, so we'll see, assuming there are people from different parts of the world that are here today. So again, thank you very much for taking the time and being here, both our guests, our panelists, as well as the attendees and the audience there. This event is being hosted by CELDF in partnership with Blue Earth Defense and the Highlander Center. CELDF has been around for about 30 years now, doing a lot of frontline community assistance work in the legal realm, grassroots organizing realm, lots of training and education efforts, all in the name of community resistance and resilience. Highlander has beat CELDF by a number of decades, been around for 90 years, doing amazing work in the South, also in the realm of education and advocacy work. Denzel will dive into more of that when he presents. And for those from the United States who may have tracked historically during the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, Highlander played a very pivotal role in the build out of civil rights movements across the United States, and continues to be a force in doing advocacy work for communities in that region of the country. Blue Earth Defense is a newer organization that has come to be, whose mission is to defend the Earth and all her inhabitants through unifying a strong global alliance for Earth protectors, for a biocentric and just society by eliminating all forms of domination and destruction. So I think there's a lot of compatibility through the three organizations that are hosting tonight and working in their own ways, along with the other groups that you'll hear about from our guests from the Philippines. The idea of tonight's event is really to kind of go through three movements. So we have the panelists, our guests, who will start to kind of describe sort of the situation, describe the problem, describe the challenges, describe the very things that make doing the good work so difficult. So kind of setting the scene for us to understand what are the conditions. And unfortunately, literally physical Mother Nature conditions now happening in the Philippines with typhoons that have rolled in and more that are coming. So just even the physical realities of that beyond just the governmental actions and even the non-governmental actions of those who are trying to quell the human rights and environmental rights activities in the Philippines as well as the Appalachian South there. After that, we asked the panelists to then come back to sort of talk about, well, despite all those barriers and those challenges, how are we navigating it? How are we being effective? How are we building the solidarity? How are we making the real impact despite the things that are set before us individually and collectively there? And then we'll end with perhaps some conversation amongst the panelists from what they hear from one another, as well as taking questions and answers from the audience as well. And I'll, in a second, get to the method of how you can put questions in throughout today's event. We also set this up that for those that are able to and are willing to support the work of the various groups involved here, a single donation page that we will then share the donations of amongst the various groups that are here tonight. There'll be links dropped into the chat and I believe posted on the Facebook live stream as well for people to access throughout the event. So your donations would be going to Blue Earth Defense, the Highlander Center, Alianza Tigalmina, the Alliance Against Mining, the Filipino group, Ethnico Bendito, InfoShop, as well as CELDF. So again, if you're so inclined, the arrangement is for us, again, in the idea of solidarity is to obviously share in maybe whatever economic support comes into this evening as well, and this morning. Again, I said for questions, feel free to drop questions in at any point. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, at least, there is something that looks like a question mark and says Q&A. If you drop your questions in there, we have people monitoring that. In fact, when we get to the kind of panelist conversation and Q&A, I'm going to hand over moderating duties to Saba Malik, who is from the Blue Earth Defense. She will be leading that portion of the event. Before I get to the introductions of the panelists and the first part of the two-part kind of presentations from each, again, just want to reinforce that there's an incredible amount of experience and expertise gathered both through the panel and I believe probably in the audience here. So I'm very excited to hear the combining of all that come together, for us to hear all that. And then largely, again, to walk away with a sense of being positive, of being ready to take action wherever we may be. You know, resistance work is not easy work, to say it plainly. But I think everyone would agree that as we build up our confidence and belief that we can be successful, that confidence can be contagious to the point where that confidence and that solidarity and that expertise all coming together is a very, very formidable force. And one that even in the most tyrannical systems of government coming up against that is going to have a force to contend with that it didn't realize how powerful it can be by the sake of people coming together, people believing in themselves, and people actually working in a manner to do the work, again, despite the conditions that they're up against. And so if anything, again, that we want people to walk away with, besides specifics, besides the stories, besides people ideally connecting with one another, is that we can do it, whether we're in the Philippines, the Appalachian South, or anywhere else in the globe when we're coming up against systems of tyranny. This is how we make it happen. So again, thank you very much for being here. So with that all aside, I want to introduce our speakers. We have JB, who is the National Coordinator for Alianza Tigalmina. Hopefully I said that with enough of a Filipino flair. Which is a national coalition in the Philippines that supports and connects 110 grassroots groups. So talk about building a network of solidarity. I'm very excited to hear JB talk more about what that looks like. Working both with local and indigenous communities as well. So really bringing in the full contingency of the people living on the islands there. Terry Lodge, who's the legal director for CELDF. Terry brings in 45 years of experience as an anti-war activist. Also working in the legal realm for civil and environmental rights. So looking forward to Terry's contribution to the event. Mario, who is an environmental and human rights lawyer based in the Philippines, specializes in documenting extrajudicial killings and opposing of human rights abuses, or works or is part of or leads an organization called Ideals. And all these organizations will drop web links in or whatever online resources we have so people can connect to it besides what gets mentioned. Denzel Caldwell, who's the program manager for economics and governance at the Highlander Research and Education Center based in Tennessee. And then Chris, who's the founder of the Mutual Aid and Community Autonomy Center known as Ethnico Bendito InfoShop in the Philippines. In fact, Chris is actively working with community members right now, helping with the flooding that's been taking place because of the typhoon. So as an element of mutual aid, that is obviously one thing that Chris's group and others is prepared to do beyond the realities of trying to do work against, government oppression. So with that, we're going to move into now the actual presentation side. So as I mentioned, the first half will be each person kind of in their own way, spending a little bit of time, a few minutes, 5 minutes or so, describing kind of the realities within their realms of work and expertise based on where they're at. So to kind of, again, set the scene. And with that, I would like to have JB start us, and then we'll move through kind of our list. And so I'll kind of cue the next person and the next person, and then we'll get to the next round. So JB, you are on center stage here.
Thank you, Kai. Good morning from the Philippines to everyone. Good evening to you who are watching and joining us. I am very excited and honored to be part of this panel discussion. Okay, what's the context that we as environmental organizations and human rights groups are facing here in the Philippines? Quickly, though, my organization is an alliance of grassroots and their support groups. Half of our members are from communities that are directly affected by mining. The other half of our members are human rights groups, legal groups, academe, faith-based, women and peasants and IP national coalitions who are directly or providing direct services to the first half. That's the only criteria we have to be part of our coalition. You are either a directly affected community or you are an organization providing direct service to the affected community. In the Philippines, I think the difficulties and challenges faced by a large part the environmental defenders groups are on three aspects. Number one is the geographic nature of the Philippines. Unlike continental countries like the US, Canada, or other European countries, we are an archipelago and we have more than 7,000 islands. It's very difficult for an environmental organization or a community who is operating on an island setting which is geographically isolated. And these are where most of the mining and extractive projects are. You're either on a mountain where the natural resources are or on an isolated island. And that alone poses serious challenges for an affected community. You add to that the context of climate change. The Philippines is always on the top three most vulnerable and at risk countries when we use the climate impact index. And because that's again because of our geography, we're in the equator line, typhoons, and then as an archipelago, the threat of the rise of oceans, and then even acidification. Whenever the climate impact indices are done annually, the Philippines is always on the top three or top five. Then you have the situation where our government is basically pushing for a more extractive nature of our development push. 10 years ago, gold and copper was the top mineral commodity being extracted and exported in the Philippines. But I have to put that into context. While there are a lot of mining projects in the Philippines, mining has never been a significant contributor to our economy. Always less than 1% contribution to our GDP. So it doesn't really make sense to many of us. Why is our government and the extractive industry, both in the Philippines and in the global north, pushing for more mining in the Philippines when it only contributes 1% to our economy? And yet this 1% of extract economy, mining itself, directly threatens over 18% of our GDP because mining directly threatens our food security. Mining directly threatens our water resources, and mining directly threatens even our fisheries and tourism. So it's very hard for communities to understand why is the government pushing such a destructive industry in the face that we are an agricultural country. We have a lot of resources for water, and our archipelago, which is on this side of the argument a blessing, provides us with a substantial source of our protein, which is our fisheries. So this is why there is a strong resistance against destructive mining. People are losing livelihoods and their lives because the extractive industry and the government are pushing for a more extractive and destructive direction for our development. Which brings me to my last minute. Why is it a growing dangerous initiative for communities to defend themselves? Global Witness, for the past 15 years, 12 years, has been issuing their annual Environmental Defenders Report. And for a period of time, the Philippines was the most dangerous country for land and environmental rights defenders, precisely because of this context that I just described. The government and the industry wants to extract more in the name of profit, but at the expense of social, environmental, and human rights and the lives and livelihoods of people. And when you have this same piece of land, when you have the same piece of land that has been declared as a protected area, we have a protected area system. The same piece of land has been declared as an ancestral domain. We have one of the most progressive Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in the whole world. This same piece of land is declared as a agriculture and food security area. And then this same piece of land is declared as a mineral land. You have the same piece of land that has been declared to have four land uses under four different categories. And this is where the conflict lies. When the same piece of land has four different land uses, whose interest and agenda will dominate? Of course, there's no debate. Those who has the most power, who has the most money, and the most influence in political and social decisions in the country, his interest will decide what is the actual use of that land. And when you have indigenous peoples, farmers, women, and even some local governments who are less powerful than the interests of the mining industry or those politicians who are beneficial owners of the mining industry, then the equation falls on the side of the extractive industry. And this is why people will resist because of the injustice. And when people resist, governments will take their police and security power to the extent they will advance their own agenda. Let me end there. I have a lot more stories to tell. And we would like to share all the stories and documentation we have. You can visit our website. And thank you to Blue Earth Defense and to CELDF for giving us this opportunity. We are certainly excited to share more stories within this hour and later on. Thank you, Kai.
That's a good setup, JB, though. I think for you, when you come back, when you get to speak again, and then I think it's also a good setup for both Terry and Mario to follow, just in the sense of what each is seeing and what each is involved in just from the legal perspective, right? So Terry, I think you're up next to kind of give us a sense of maybe on a broader aspect versus just the Appalachian South, but kind of what you've been involved in, what you've witnessed historically, what you see going on, currently, in the sense of actions being taken as people are trying to do, human rights work and environmental work or anything kind of in the realm of pushing back and, building viable resistance.
Thank you. I hope you'll forgive me if I sound like I'm trying to tell the history of the United States in 5 minutes, but that's kind of what I'm going to be doing. I think that what we are globally confronted with is disaster capitalism plus ecological overshoot, and those two things added together are disaster capitalism overshoot. Naomi Klein made famous the concept of disaster capitalism, which was a recognition about 17 or 18 years ago that capitalism somehow has a magical way of bending and appearing in the middle of our greatest wars, catastrophes, and other loss. It has a way of making money out of misery. National governments have been taken over by this gaping economic maw. Capitalism has taken an out of control circumstance and become even more intense, more of a zombie type of force in our daily lives. And governments, the corporate state concept is now very nearly perfect. Governments are made in the graven image of these zombies that have come to rule us. Our governments from those who pass laws to those who implement them to those who interpret them, stand by to boost the economic fortunes of those who have a lot, with only as an afterthought boosting those with a little. War has become the measure of the health of the state. Building death infrastructure is a leading American industry. Nuclear weapons, our vast Navy, high-tech missiles, planes, drones, armor, bullets, grenades, many nuclear plants to use in theaters of war to power computerization of the battlefield. That's American industry in very large part. The increasing tension between the few democratic values that we ever had in this country and capitalism is quickly resolving against democracy. The U.S. was never a genuine democracy, but the aspects of it, voting, certain types of citizen participation, means that citizens can make their own laws. Those things are very passé. They are becoming difficult. Voting itself has become an obstacle course, a gotcha game every few years. Repression is filling the void. Corporate sponsorship of politicians, from dog catchers to presidents, has become the norm in our country. And all the while, technology is becoming more efficient, pushing more and more people to the bottom of or completely out of the economy, leaving them with fewer and fewer prospects and less usefulness to the economies. In America, dissenters who want a different life in which to raise children, pursue knowledge, culture, the arts in ways that require less suffering, less destruction, and more love, have, since at least the 1870s, 150 years, frequently been branded communists, tied to the mysterious global movement by those who want to hold on to power. 75 years ago, right after World War II, the red-baiting and witch-hunting politicians of Senator Joe McCarthy era held sway over how arts and culture in the workplace, the military, and participatory politics functioned. Movements and philosophies that didn't center around sheer profit motive as threats were pushed to the margins, and where possible, they were even eradicated. As the claimed threat of global communism declined throughout the 80s and the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union broke up, many of us naively thought that war would become a rarer phenomenon and that high-pressure global nuclear confrontations would ease. Capitalism's need, however, to label and demonize its critics in order to survive simply rebranded commies into terrorists. The fantasies that problems among governments might be solved by more talk and less lead gave way more than ever to the economic mammoths reaching through governments to destroy and despoil and colonize everywhere in every direction. As climate chaos has begun to show up in sea level rise and rape and ruined countrysides, collapsed agriculture, desertification, destruction of global fisheries, activists have come to understand that polite negotiations among government policymakers and testimony from endangered island nations will come to naught as long as capitalism is the decision-making force that dictates how we continue to use fossil fuels and mine and minerals. Popular identification of terrorists still includes commies. I've been called a commie in the last few years. A lot of my friends still are. But now we're in an era where dissenters are also anti-Semites. We're a tiny country in the Middle East, hell-bent on engrafting European values and lifestyle on indigenous people, along with its much larger sponsor here in the United States, are on a rampage to reshape the entire region and, in fact, send a frightening, bullying message to the globe with a politics that now openly is about unbridled murder. So it's not merely ironic that the anti-Semitic McCarthy era has been revitalized, and what I call the paranoid style in American politics is being resuscitated now. Capitalism requires it more than ever. Democracy, as I've said, is inconvenient. critics and their speech and their demands are getting in the way of making profit. Democracy, or some pretense of it, sucks up a lot of energy. Having too many people make decisions gets in the way of making a great deal of money. So war and associated bullying is the message. This is how nation states interact. We are in the process of destroying the United Nations, destroying treaties governing nuclear weapons control, arms control, destroying international human rights law. We're destroying any respect on anything but a local basis for any kind of public participation. And the new, almost a symbol of the new era in the United States with the Trump presidency is Section 2CI of the Immigration and Nationality Act. That's the 1952 McCarthy-era law that is being used repeatedly by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, gets to decide whether somebody's continued presence in the United States would have, quote, potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. Who gets to decide what adverse foreign policy consequences there are, of course, is up to Marco and his boss. And we are presently facing the end, the bitter, ragged end of the American exceptionalist view of the world. It seems that disaster capitalism so owns things that now we are deporting contributing people. We are deporting people from other nations who are here, in fact, for the most part, legally and peacefully, and certainly very much inclined to leave a positive impression on our nation. But next up, as the machine perfects deportation, next up is going after naturalized citizens and birthright citizenship. Ultimately, it's possible to foresee that even citizenship. I was born in a small town in the state of Indiana, but it's possible now to see that citizenship right is going to be as revocable as a license to drive a car. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Mario, we have you up next to kind of share with the audience your experience and background in the work that you do as a environmental and human rights attorney there in the Philippines.
Thank you, Kai, and good morning, everyone from the Philippines. I'm equally privileged and honored to be part of this conversation. Now, briefly, IDEAL stands for Initiative for Dialogue Through Empowerment and Alternative Legal Services. So the specific area that we're working on as a law group, alternative law group, is on access to justice. So IDEAS was formed in the 1990s and have engaged in a number of social issues in the Philippines, like agrarian reform, labor issues, and very recently under the Duterte administration, where I was hired as the senior lawyer and consultant for the Human Rights Program. So we documented various human rights violations in relation to the war on drugs of Duterte. But IDEAS is also engaged in a number of initiatives to provide access to justice, like providing legal identities to the indigenous peoples and marginalized group, especially in southern Philippines, in Mindanao, because it's very ironic that up until now, there are a number of people who still don't have a birth certificate. And that means if you don't have that, it means you can't access social services and you're like a stateless person. So it's like no entry, no ID. And when you can access development services from government, so you are not recognized in development planning. And they're also engaged in rights education. So we think that educating people in terms of rights would enable them to have this right. claim-making behavior or remedy-seeking behavior, because from the context of human rights, it is the obligation of the state to provide these services, among others, the access to justice. And particularly, I think the context that Terry mentioned about the U.S. as a global power, we are tied with our colonial history, a former colony of the Philippines, and most of these policies have a direct impact on the social economic life of the people, and in a way, poverty since time immemorial has remained unchecked despite the many development aid that is given to us, and US is one of the biggest development partners of the Philippines, being a former colony. Because the Philippines, the poverty has been it is an impediment for people to really access legal services, because even legal services is really difficult to access for the majority of the population here in the Philippines, particularly the indigenous groups, farmers, fisher folk, among others. And during the time of Duterte, or even before, at the time of Marcos dictatorship, it's really difficult for people to really seek redress of their grievances, although this is part of their constitutional right. Under the Duterte administration, we think Duterte happened because there's no transitional justice that has happened. There were martial law victims who were given a compensation, but there is no recognition from the state that what happened, the martial law, which was propped up by the support of the U.S. policies, the 20 years of Marcos dictatorship was supported by the U.S. policy, and a lot of people have suffered. And we have this compensation because of the violation of their human rights. And up until now, Ideals is still on this aspect of providing legal services to the vulnerable and marginalized groups in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. I'm very curious again, like with JB presented, what does that landscape look like? What have you been able to contribute despite, the conditions that you just described? Again, very excited to get to our next phase here, but we have two more speakers, Denzel and then Chris. So Denzel, of course, you're our kind of lone voice to bring in the Appalachian South aspect of the event, but having known you now for a little bit, I'm sure you will have no problem representing what needs to be represented in this conversation and presentation. So please, Denzel.
Not a problem. Peace and good afternoon or good morning to others. So when we're talking about the problem in this current moment here in the United States, a lot of people are actively discussing the current Trump regime. And oftentimes in this conversation, there's a reference to Project 2025. But I'd like to pose something different. I'd like to say that the root of the problem is not Project 2025, but the settler colonial project of 1776, otherwise known as the U.S. Empire, which I would posit to say is one of the greatest threats to environment and humanity. And so as Terry mentioned earlier, it was important to name capitalism as the problem, and its greatest vector is, of course, the U.S. Empire. Domestically, there's no more critical place to display this problem than the U.S. South. And so if we think about the historical context, this area and thus this empire by extension began with the genocide of indigenous Turtle Island populations and the creation of plantation economies on sacred land through the exploitation of Western and Central African peoples that were kidnapped. And so when we think about the evolution of this empire, we have to think about the one attempt or political window, we could say, where there was an attempt for revolutionary transformation. And this first attempt would be through the U.S. Civil War, and after which there was a brief political window, an opportunity for transformation known as the Reconstruction era. But due to the desire to maintain European plantation economy hegemony, and due to the growing interest of industrial capitalists at the time, that window was slammed shut by the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877, where we see the federal troops leave the U.S. South, and followed by what some would call the nadir period of U.S. history, or sort of the lowest point, where the increase in state, non-state white supremacist terrorism was enacted throughout the U.S. South on Black people. And so it's no coincidence that during this time, the late 19th century going into the early 20th century, is when we start to see the U.S. begin to expand its colonial outreach, right? This is when we start to see more so of the U.S. become what we now understand as the global power. And so in many ways, when we talk about the current problem, one way of characterizing it is the sort of nationalization, or in some instances, if you think about the global stage, the globalization of the plantation. And so when we talk about that, and we think about the U.S. South, what are we seeing in this current moment? What we're seeing is the intensification of what we would call neo-Confederate control. What does that look like? So throughout the region, we are seeing the intensification of reproductive rights being stripped further away from everyday working class folks in the U.S. South through a state-by-state basis. We are seeing the intensification of both state and non-state white supremacist violence that exists not only to attack marginalized peoples, whether it be Black, Indigenous, or others, but also serve as a force to attack any sort of larger coalitions, working class coalitions that are challenging the legitimacy of U.S. capital domestically. We are also seeing the intensification of climate disaster and the deregulation of any sort of what little protections we have in the region to ensure that working class folks, predominantly poor, Black, Indigenous, Latina, are to whatever degree we can be safe from these climate disasters, and so on and so forth. And so in so many ways, it's no coincidence that many of the conditions that we see spread throughout the U.S. South, particularly in rural areas, and particularly in predominantly Black, Indigenous, Latina, and colonized communities, it's no coincidence that many of the conditions we see there reflect in some ways, the conditions that we see throughout the global South. And so it's because of this that, it's very clear that the root of the problem here lies in this original settler colonial project that we call the United States, that in many ways has spread its sort of colonial wings and continued to exploit all parts of the planet, and maintaining its power through the various military commands, or the 800 military outposts that it has throughout, and domestically intensifying its violent capitalist control within the borders through increased suppression on working class and colonized communities.
Thank you, Denzel. Chris, you are up next to give sort of a sense of what you are up against, what the people you work with are up against, just kind of the realities of I guess what your daily life is like in that part of the Philippines.
Okay, thank you for the people behind this event. I'm happy and thankful that I be part of this. So my presentation is related to this ethico bandito in push-up spreading information, but I will tackle a concern. So I write a presentation. It's called the role of fake news and disinformation and the lack of access on reliable information as a recipe for authoritarianism and fascism. So the rise of social media created a double-edged sword. On one side, it offered an open space to people to express themselves, form communities, and access information outside of mainstream channel. On the other, it enabled the widespread proliferation of fake news, disinformation, and algorithm-driven echo chambers, tools that have become vital to the resurgence of authoritarianism and fascism across the globe, including the USA, the Philippines, Brazil, and beyond. Access to information is still a privilege, not a right. Even in the age of free information, structural inequalities continue to determine who gets to speak and who gets heard. Historically, traditional media like a newspaper, magazine, radio, and television was tightly controlled by elites. Today, while digital platforms appear decentralized, they are still subject to corporate and political manipulation. According to doctrines like unrestricted warfare, media becomes a weapon, not just for communication, but for disinformation, confusion, and the erosion of public trust. The battle of propaganda still happening in a new battlefield, and a war on narrative are ongoing. In the Philippines, we saw this manipulation at full force during the Duterte regime. The so-called war on drugs relied heavily on a narrative that framed drug users as the root of crime and social decay. The result, mass support for extrajudicial killing, the normalization of police brutality, and the erosion of human rights. Similarly, the use of red tagging demonized progressive movements and activists, paving the way for forced disappearances, warrantless arrests, and the silencing of dissent. Marcos Jr., content creators. I witnessed the war on drugs unfold firsthand. The paranoia, fear, and distrust it sowed in communities was devastating. I knew people in the drug scene. They were not just numbers or case studies. They were poor, traumatized, struggling with mental health issue, and burdened by systemic neglect. They were human. Our fellow Food That Bombs volunteers were killed by the police. Some of my childhood friends died too. I saw one of them lying lifeless, 16 bullets in his body. Under Duterte, killing became not just unacceptable, but ordinary. Now, Marcos Jr. Our again, Trump won again. How did this happen? There are many factors, but within the Philippine context, one uncomfortable truth must be acknowledged. The progressive and leftist movement have largely failed to earn the public trust, whether due to sectarianism, internal division, a disconnect from everyday struggles, or the inability to speak in a language the masses understand. The movement failed to offer a compelling alternative narrative. The war on truth is real, and we are losing ground. To move forward, we must not only expose fake news and authoritarian propaganda, but also rebuild trust, solidarity, and shared vision from the grassroots up. Thanks.
I think that's a perfect lead in, Chris, to moving to the next section here, which is how, with everything that everyone described, the persistence that's needed, the viable resistance that need to be built, the effectiveness. You brought up a couple great examples of just the power of propaganda, and how that has to be navigated, as well as if you're going to build a viable resistance, there has to be trust amongst people in different levels here. And, clearly that's not the case in a concerted way yet, to be a force against, either government at this point, whether it's the Philippines or the US. But even within all that, clearly all of you are still doing everything and more to kind of create at least the conditions, if not advancement in that way. And so we want to shift now to each of you getting a chance to sort of describe that, either historically or contemporarily, on what that persistence of real resistance looks like. So we'll kind of go back now to the top of the order. So JB, if you wouldn't mind beginning, and then we'll move through the rest of our panelists from there.
Thank you, Kai. So refreshing to be having this conversation with comrades all over the world, and it's part also of the re-energizing and inspiring work. Because in this line of work, we need all the psychosocial well-being and energy that we can get. But to go back to the stories, yeah, resistance. Alianza Tigil Mina celebrated our 20th year a couple of months ago. And that's 20 years of, from our perspective, successful solidarity and community action that has led to some victories. But what do these actions look like? From the wide spectrum of available actions and community empowerment, I think we can describe our campaign, which is the core mandate. We are coming together to challenge the policies and practices of destructive mining. And so as a campaign, it was understood and it was delegated as the main task of our alliance is to defend the sites of struggles, or what we call SOS. SOS meaning like an international sign of help, but also as an empowering term, SOS are sites of struggles. And that is our core mandate. We need to defend the sites of struggles. The messaging and engagement with national government and solidarity with international networks are also key elements of this resistance and empowerment. But the main mandate is defend the sites of struggles. And what does this defense of the sites of struggle look like? First is strengthening the community itself. As a coalition and as an environmental and human rights defense campaign, it was made clear to us. As a coalition, we have members who are organizations. And so as ATM, we do not do community organizing. Our members are the ones who organize the community. What we add value as a campaign is that we strengthen, organize, and establish coalitions within a mining affected area. And so that we allow a platform for women, farmers, indigenous peoples, young people to come together. And in this platform of a coalition or network, this is where the legal groups like the ideals of our Mario is coming from, where the church group or the academe or the human rights groups and all other stakeholders can contribute and give their support. So that's our organizing work, providing a platform for coalition or task forces or networks at the local level to spring and then enable them to work together to fight and challenge a common enemy, which in our campaign right now is the destructive mining. And so where does this energy of coalition building lead to? In most instances, the creative ways of resisting are crafted, designed, and implemented. So, the Philippines is a Catholic country, so we recognize the very powerful, strong, soft power of religion and the Catholic Church. I mean, there might be some differences on some conservative nature, but here in this part of the world, Catholic Church, inspired by Pope Francis, is in the forefront of environmental and human rights defense. That's one creative action. So, we have priests and bishops leading prayer rallies, discernment circles. We have religious folk organizing learning sessions. And then we have the religious groups, faith-based groups working with the communities in very vocal expressions, including protests, barricades, and even mobilizations against mining companies. But in the same way, resistance also means strengthening and amplifying the voices of the weak and the marginalized. I think the biggest and most powerful resistance is when local communities who 10 years ago would never think of going to a local officials and say, here is an opposition paper. You have to listen to us. We voted you into power. You have to listen to us. That's the most powerful expression of resistance we have seen when people are actually standing up and demanding accountability from local and national governments. On the other hand, one very inspiring form of resistance that we have seen, to me, I'm 52 years old, and I'd like to think myself as the third generation of activists here in the Philippines, way back from of course the revolution in the late 1800s, and then this second generation of activists from the dictatorship in the late 70s. And I think for me the most inspiring resistance right now is how young people from this generation who have a different set of tools are slowly understanding the gravity and the enormity of the challenges they face. And then they come up with their own solutions. So, using digital media, using this centralized form of expression. I don't have a TikTok account, I don't have a Facebook, and I don't use Messenger. I gave up on Twitter a couple of years ago when Elon Musk bought it. So, but I'm a heavy Reddit user. But that's about my social media connection now. But 3 years ago, our alliance said, we have to hire young people to animate our campaign. And when we made that decision at the height of the pandemic, when we were transitioning to digital and online platforms of campaigning and empowerment, and we made that conscious decision, we have to hire younger people from the universities, those who are blooming activists who want to say something, who want to do something, but because of pandemic, they were constrained. And so we kind of looked for this. We organized young people, and within a year, when we had a dozen volunteers, the whole anti-mining campaign took a totally different direction on the digital and online. The way we were engaging media, the way we were organizing our communities, and even the way our environmental veteran leaders were relating to the next generation of leaders. And I say the word inspiring because I have never seen such an energetic sector such as this youth from I think they're Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So I will admit I do not understand many of the tools and the platforms, but I'm really excited. 8 years ago, I could not imagine an annual meeting of environmental defenders dedicating 2 hours of our whole day reflection and assessment. And we had that session titled current metrics on digital media of the anti-mining campaign. And I said, what? And I didn't realize like we were reaching 25-30,000 digital engagements because of one creative action. I didn't understand how TikTok was contributing to our messaging to national government. But really, and I think while we recognize, as Chris has said, there are very dangerous pitfalls if we do not know how to navigate the digital landscape. I think there is very valuable space for the traditional way of resistance and community empowerment. And we have to harness the potential that digital and online tools and platforms offer to us. Just a quick example before I end. 5 years ago, I would have understood a thunderclap as something of a signal of a meteorological event. But now, a thunderclap on Twitter is something that the two of my young staff would say, sir, this is something that we have to do, and all you have to do is post this on the ATM Twitter account, and then you have to repost it from your own Twitter account. And so, but what will happen? Oh, just post it there, and then we will just see our metrics go there. So that for me is an empowering experience, and I suppose this is also an empowering experience from the young generation themselves. And I think a young person here in the urban setting where Chris operates and where Maki is also familiar with, and most of our audience are, a young person who is very active on TikTok or Twitter or on other social media will probably have the same empowering experience for a young person on an geographically isolated island who has a very creative way of expressing his or her resistance, as long as we ensure that he or she has a gadget, that she has access to a cell phone signal, and that she has $1 for the next 7 days so she can have access to the internet. I think that kind of equal empowerment is a very inspiring inspiration for the young people, and we should be encouraging it. Thank you.
Thanks, JB. Terry, you are up.
Thank you. JB, I think we need some consultation about how to deal with social media from you. Wow. There are many things that we need to do. What we at CELDF attempt to do is, and have for 25 years, is work with local communities to try to use a mechanism that has largely gathered dust and been forgotten in many respects, the local power of initiative, that where citizens actually circulate a petition to propose a law, an actual law with details and enforceability and all that, and bypassing the idea of a legislature or a city council or a Congress, that we, the people, are able to enact things. We focus on issues, and as Chris was also talking about, and you too, JB, the whole idea of finding commonality among issues, quit allowing what I call bourgeois divides to be forced on us, divides of whether you're for Trump or Biden, divides about whether or not you can endure or allow people of different sexual persuasions to work with you. All of the things that are used to keep us from talking about the things we have in common and taking power. So we try to advise, and on many occasions have gone to court in support of local communities' right to have that ancient democratic tool still available. But it is a terrific uphill fight for all of the reasons that I think all of the activist-minded people on this conference call, this webinar, can imagine. There is the actual lessons that occur to me are that we also stress the rights of nature, the rights of nature being defined as the fact that all living things are dependent upon ecosystems that are being rapidly plundered and destroyed, especially ecosystems that focus around water. But our emphasis is very counter to the exploitative myth of capitalism, that we must endlessly consume raw material in order to sustain a material level for humanity that maybe a lot of humanity isn't that interested in having. But as I look at the evolving repression in the United States, and it didn't begin when Donald Trump took office. It began many decades ago, particularly in the late 1800s into the 20th century. Labor unions were formed, movements came together, social reform efforts became more and more concentrated and urban. But what I've learned is we have to understand there's not a normal to return to. I think we're looking at a steady diet of disaster capitalism. You have to find the signal in the noise. You have to learn. And it sounds to me that you people in the Philippines are definitely focused on how to teach resistance techniques, resistance as opposed to mere oppositional critiquing, where the Democrats in our Congress make a few strangled noises against the big, beautiful tax act that has more than any legislation in the history of this country is going to solidify the billionaire class and expand it somewhat. There's no more normal to go back to, and we have to understand and learn and teach one another how to resist the things that are coming down in support of disaster capitalism. We have to make them pay. We have to, I think often of the old union technique of work slowdown called working to rule, where unions basically will do what is minimally expected of them on the job, slowing things down, sending a very harsh message to management that we are indispensable to how things go on, how things are accomplished and achieved around here. Mutual aid, which I'm also hearing your stories about mutual aid efforts that you're making as part of your activism, including things like alternative systems, alternative economics of barter, and collective sharing of material resources and medicines and things like that. Alternative means of educating children, of urban agriculture and as I say, of various types of co-op and collective types of activities. But the resistance is, number one, to carve out your lifestyle and insist upon it, force the opposition to have to burn a lot of time, energy, patience, optics in shameful and embarrassing ways to them, to make their long-term strategy less attainable and less affordable. But it isn't going to be normal anymore. And if we allow things to be normalized, like genocide, like the repression that you've described that has gone on in the last couple of decades, in particular in the Philippines, you can't ever let those memories simply become part of the accepted woodwork, the framework around what we do in our everyday lives, because that is when we're defeated. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Mario, if you could bring in sort of your world and perhaps how that looks in the sense of effective resistance and the things that you're involved in.
Yeah, thank you, Kai. I think Chris put it succinctly on how the Duterte administration was able to not to make repression effective in the Philippines through the use of misinformation. And that provided a lot of challenges to the work that we do because human rights has been demonized. And to do that, we need to be strategic. We told ourselves we need to survive Duterte. And how do we do it? So first, I think in all the institutions during the time of Duterte were demonized. The judiciary, the media, and it was only the church, though it has been also got a lot of flashing and cursing from Duterte. It's the only institutions that we felt was also very effective in terms of reaching out to the communities affected by the war on drugs. Of course, the so-called war on drugs, that's the narrative. It's actually a war on the poor. About 30,000 people were killed, but if you look at the statistics, these are the poor people in the urban areas, mostly. And they were killed just for the sake of promoting the idea that drug is a problem and not poverty. So we partnered with the church, and we do it by doing legal mission. So when we say legal mission, we pose it as like doing a free legal service to the communities, and it's also a way of a smoke screen for us to document the killings at the community level. So we think that the church is a safe place because they also offer sanctuary to the victims, and they are our major partners in that regard. Second, I think JB mentioned about working with young people. I think the challenge in lawyering, alternative lawyering in the Philippines, is recruiting really experienced lawyers working in work like this. When I came to Ideas, that was in 2016, 2017, I think, I was the most senior lawyer, and I'm working with new graduates, new young paralegals. But it is also the strength of our team. As JB mentioned, they have more ideas. They have that passion and idealism, and I think it worked to our advantage. During the time of pandemic, it's difficult to reach out to the communities. So we have this Tisha Justicia. It's a online legal service. There's a chatbot, and there are young lawyers who answers their queries. And in fact, in just 1 or 2 years that we operated, we were nominated during the World Justice Forum. We placed among the top 5 of the initiatives in relation to work on justice. And that was during the time of pandemic. Third, I think legal education, as I've said earlier, because human rights has been demonized, and it's difficult of course, to challenge that narrative of Duterte. Has weaponized everything, but it's still difficult. And the factor I think also Chris mentioned about the fragmentation in the progressive movement, and there's really no consensus on how to deal with the human rights problem in relation to the killings on the war on drugs. In the past, during the time of Marcos, there's no debate on that. You're dealing with activists, political prisoners and all that. But now you are dealing with people who are deemed unwanted people. And it's difficult, no? And I even experienced at one point when I was about to file a case for habeas corpus for children who were held by PIDEA, and we have to file to recover them. And I received a text message from a colleague in the human rights group. And he said, Attorney Maki, that's my nickname, Maki. And he said, you should be careful. You might be involved in the wrong case, etc. And that, I think, is the very impact of how the narrative of the war on drugs has been so embedded in the mindset, in the feelings of people. It's really unsafe at that time, and we need to be strategic. So we also adopted this strategic litigation that it's difficult, so we focus on documentation. And I said, documenting all these cases, later on we have the time to build our cases, but for now we need to do good documentation. And we say good documentation, we do it in the context of do no harm, meaning you provide legal services and documentation, but it should be victim centered, and it should not worsen the situation of people you are working with than before, no? So it's something that we think is very important in the line of work and up until now, because the families and victims of the war on drugs has yet to seek accountability from the excesses of the so-called war on drugs of Duterte. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Just quickly before we get to Denzel and to Chris, just as a reminder, if you have a question, use that question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. And also just as a reminder, if donations, we'll put the link back into the group chat for everyone to click on that donation link. As I mentioned at the beginning, any of the money that comes in will be shared equally amongst the 5 groups, including Mario's group that you just heard about. So Denzel, you are next.
Yeah, so I'd just like to start off just from a historical context and saying that though in many ways we could see the U.S. South as one of the more concentrated, devastating areas of capitalism's destruction and empire's destruction. It's also ground zero for some of the most notable forms of resistance, right? And this tradition goes back to the beginning, right? Whether we're talking about various uprisings on the plantation from enslaved Africans or indigenous Turtle Island folk, to one of the greatest general strikes that we've seen in U.S. history, i.e. the U.S. Civil War, when enslaved Africans decided to leave the plantation or challenge the heart of capital at the time. Throughout the late 19th and 20th century, where we see a lot of labor organization, labor unions, and that are coalitions in many ways, oftentimes with an internationalist analysis, many times that were multiracial, who were leading the charge against U.S. capital and hegemony. And in that history, Highlander has had a 92-year role in facilitating liberation struggles throughout the South, whether we're talking about early 90s with various labor union organizing throughout the U.S. South and Appalachia, and particularly building multiracial labor coalitions through our sort of educational folk school space, to setting up space on our grounds for the organizing that would lead to things such as the Montgomery bus boycott or the student sit-ins that happened throughout the South to desegregate the public facilities in southern cities and challenge the legitimacy of Jim Crow. We've been here in so many different ways, whether we go through the 70s and 80s through the environmental rights struggles, particularly in Appalachia, where we're talking about coal mining, the labor organizing against that, to the anti-globalization efforts. That has happened in the South, right, amongst other parts of amongst the U.S. When I think about now and some of the work that we're involved in now, I look to the inspiration from various people's movement assemblies. So as we've discussed before, as we see sort of like what little veils, so-called veils of democracy wither away, especially with the oncoming or continuation of that type of suppression from this regime. A lot of the response in pockets of the South have been through people's movement assemblies, or something I'd like to call insurgent democracies, where folks who at a local level are, instead of, or at least parallel to the current political infrastructure that we have, are organizing communities together to make decisions around some of the political and economic problems that they're dealing with at a local level, whether it's something as like such as the issue of water and who controls water, to who sits in a particular office, so that in a way that allows them to shape and combat some of the sort of repressive state and federal sort of policies that we're seeing more and more of now. In addition to People's Movement Assembly work, we also see, especially in the region, various mutual aid networks forming. So as I said, as we're seeing the intensification of what we like to call neo-Confederate destruction of colonized communities, working class communities throughout the South, there are many efforts, budding efforts, to where communities are keeping each other safe, right? Through building sort of emergency response in the face of climate disasters such as Hurricane Helene, or whether we're thinking about various mutual aid responses in the midst of cancer alleys that exist throughout in different parts of the South, or if we're talking about efforts to combat the continued theft of natural resources, such as, for example, folks beginning to organize against the XAI systems that Elon Musk has set up in Memphis, Tennessee, where a lot of the natural water is being contaminated. And so I say this to say that throughout the South, there are multiple budding and growing efforts to combat not only the continued sort of suppression of working class colonized folks throughout the South, but also to combat in many ways from the inside the global threat that the U.S. empire is enacting on the rest of the world. And so Highlander in particular plays a very critical role in catalyzing those spaces, whether it's giving different folks throughout the ecosystem the opportunity to gather and then build a synthesis and strategy and tactics, or if it's sort of like producing and creating workshops around building PMAs, around thinking a little bit differently about civics, not so much as a way to continue participating in this farce of a democracy, but more so thinking of ways to build parallel structures or build dual power for some folks. And it also includes like thinking through and with Southerners and folks of the global majority around how to build survival infrastructure, not only to build in response to climate disaster, but frankly, fascist violence that exists, especially here in the South, where not only do we see the increase of militarized police violence, but also violence that we see with spaces like the ICE forces or the erection of cop cities, right? And so this is the role that Highlander finds itself in as we're building and supporting various pockets and networks of Southern liberation forces. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Denzo. I think that dovetails nicely into Chris rounding out this portion before we get to kind of whatever group discussion that Saba thinks would be good, and then whatever questions have come in since. So Chris, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you again. For me, it's very challenging that sometimes I feel that we are alienating communities or masses. So my proposal is to really normalize mutual aid, solidarity, and culture of sharing in the community, and support community-led projects and initiatives. Example, what happened when Duterte regime are in power? Community pantry, when the COVID-19 happened, community pantry was the strong force that led by one or 10 community pantries, then became 6,000 community pantries all over the Philippines. And this show force led to questions the government function on a COVID response. On this thing, if we give a practical and beneficial things or initiative that for people to get. Maybe it will create an impact in some way. Example, the community pantry, it's not a very organizational approach. It's very decentralized, and it pop up in different places without a central authority that lead them or command them. It just happens simultaneously and spontaneously. Happened in the Philippines on COVID-19 pandemic, and that's one thing I really proud that it attacked the government inefficiency to govern in emergency, medical emergency at that time. So I think it will also helpful in other organizing thing. It's intersectional. If we do mutual aid initiative, you can address ecological issues, you can address labor issues, you can address land rights issues. If we have this kind of mutual aid initiative in every locality. Example here in Pasig City, where are located, me and Bas, another comrade, we are trying to work with the housing community project here in housing project here in Pasig. We try to talk with the homeowners association and their administrator if we can partner together to promote self-manageable decentralized solar power energy, but funded by LGU or the local government unit. But it's still in the process, still in the negotiation. So this kind of attempt for people to take power on their own hands to control energy or alternative source of energy, to control their food, how to make food on their own community. Maybe this is some efforts that we need to also acknowledge in fighting against this massive destruction of environment. So that's only my suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to step away and hand it over now to Saba Malik from Blue Earth Defense to lead you guys in whatever discussion she has in mind. And then I know that Saba and others from behind the scenes have been tracking questions that have come in. So I will step away and leave it to you and Ja.
Well, thank you so much, Kai. My name's Saba Malik, and I'm part of this new organization, Blue Earth Defense. And I'm really happy to be here. And thank you so much to all of the panelists for your excellent presentations. So much thoughtful, so much to consider, a lot of food for thought here. Just to clear up, we're going to have a bit of a free-flowing conversation between the panelists now. And we'll also get to the question and answers, the Q&A. The Q&A that we have a little tab for people to ask questions. I think there might have been some confusion there. You don't need to type the answers. Myself and Jar will take it in turns to read out the question and have panelists respond. And then, if there's a particular panelist who's been asked for a response, or obviously we will let you know. This time is dedicated for the speakers to have a few minutes to dialogue and respond to each other, and we'll flow into the Q&A. So if any of you would like to respond to some of the brilliant points that we've been hearing, please go ahead. Does anyone, you can raise your hand and say, I want to say something. Go ahead, JB.
Yeah. Thank you, Saba. I want to make 2 points. One is an affirmation on what Denzel and Terry has been sharing. I really appreciate this historical perspective that they took in this conversation. This is something that I personally feel is something that we need to enrich back here in the Philippines. Our education system was patterned after the American system. We were under Spain for 330 years, but they never established an education system here. It was the 40 years under American colonization that the public school system was established here. And yet, we see corruption and inefficiency and incompetence in the past 60 years of the Philippine government erode that educational system. And so having a historical perspective on this kind of conversations of community empowerment resistance is for me a very crucial element whenever we do awareness raising or capacity building. But as I've mentioned earlier, this is the kind of challenge that we also face here. How do you engage a generation that only has a 30-second window for for engagement on you? And I say that as a challenge for us. There must be a way for us to generate that kind of engagement with this young generation, aside from relying on the available technology. But we have to use some other form of creativity and methodology that will ensure that we are delivering the core message without losing the audience. And I appreciate that, of course, there are traditional and sure-footed ways of establishing and launching our resistance campaigns. And we have to be conscious and purposive in using these time-tested methodologies of resistance and empowerment, couple it with how the young generation wants to communicate. And I feel this is why we have to have a serious conversation with young activists who will internalize this kind of discipline of historical appreciation and even historical way of analyzing the current crisis, and then finding out the appropriate ways on how this generation would like to interpret and eventually respond to the crisis. But my other, for me, a personal question is, with all of this situation on misinformation and media manipulation, I have relatives in the US and I have very close friends from college. Some of them activists, some of them were actually armed insurgents to, after People Power in 1986 when they kicked out the dictator. So imagine, after we kicked out the dictator in 1986, we did still have colleagues back then when I was still in college who did decide to go and carry up arms against the national government. But now they're in the, I mean, after several decades, they had a change of heart, they had a different perspective, and eventually some of them migrated to Canada, to the US. And they tell me they cannot believe what is happening right now in the US. More so of the Filipinos who are in Canada being an audience on the on just literally on the other side of the fence, and they say, "Ah, we cannot believe what is happening here in the US." So really we are perplexed on how the progressives and the left are reacting on what's happening to you right now. And as Mafia said earlier, when America sneezes, the Philippine economy gets a flu. So when your president suddenly declared tariffs all over the world, I work with a lot of rural industries, and the poultry industry and the fisheries industries here are tumbling all over because of that. But for me, I'm very interested, how is the left reacting and adjusting the resistance to what is, for lack of a better word, the rise of fascism. I mean, your eyes with their masks are literally a modern version of the KKK there. But I'm interested, how is the left reacting and planning to creatively address this? Thank you.
Can I just remind everyone, we only have till 8 o'clock. So comments and questions, can we keep them as short as possible? Because we haven't got to the question and answers in the main from the main forum yet. So who wants to take that question, JP? Go ahead, Denzel.
Yeah, I don't mind that. I wish we had more time to talk about that question, but I could say a couple things in short. I would actually like to make the assertion that right now, from my point of view, there's a need to build the US left, because right now the US left as a larger force does not exist. And I think that's important to name that in this moment, because if we look at historical context, many of the forces that will become that were sort of would have been the beginnings of a US left were thoroughly erased, right? And so right now the call for this current moment, amongst many other things, for people who would constitute the US left is to build it. And so I think, with that being said, I think it's important to name that we live in the greatest propaganda machine in human history. Right. So one of the biggest challenges to building the US left is just the decades and decades of not only anti-communism, but also individualist tendencies within movements. So, and I think the shining light that is giving us an opportunity to think through this are some of the increasing repression and the survival responses that people are having in communities to these things. I think though these sort of material responses can create the basis for building this larger US left, but again, that requires us to do what I believe is a Herculean feat, which is to overcome this sort of individualist tendency that is so ingrained in us here, and to take serious what it means to build parties, build organization, build mutual aid networks across the spectrum of what we need to not only survive the moment, but also to build alternative visions, right? Because the reality is here, the right, which I would say is not just the Republican Party, but the two major parties, have been very assertive about creating worldviews, political visions for multiple decades. And now it's important for us who want to build a US left to do the same.
Thank you so much, Denzel, for that. Is there anyone else on the panel who has a question for someone, or should we go straight to questions?
I think Attorney Mackey is raising his hand. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to respond to or comment on what Denzel mentioned about rebuilding the left. I think part of that rebuilding there should be unlearning things and relearning things. I think, speaking from our experience in the Philippines, the left and even the progressive movement have failed in that regard, in terms of, I think, specifically communicating what are these ideals in real terms, the bread and butter issues, not just ideological and everything. And in my experience with ideas, the communication part, we have the strategic communication strategy. The messaging is very important. And I think it's one way to connect people and reconnect them again and see what is left and rebuild from them. That's all.
Thank you so much for that, Attorney Mackey. So Saba, I would like to pick one question from the Q&A, and I will pick this question from Karen. Her question is, what were some of the mistakes you made and what did you learn from them? Thank you. I think this is a really important question. Anyone who would like to answer that question?
Sure, I can take a first quick attempt here. Yeah, I mean, with campaigning at the national level, we are going to make mistakes. I remember vividly a very, very crucial event in our campaign. Of course, we were a campaign to stop mining, and I think this happened on the 6th or 7th year in our campaign. And an indigenous community who has resisted the entry of mining projects in their territory for more than a decade already, even before our alliance was set up. And on the 6th year of our campaign, so they were like practically 11 years already resisting the mining company. The indigenous leader called us, several of us in the anti-mining campaign, and said, we have to say yes to the mining company. And of course, this was pre-pandemic, before the pandemic. And so we were in a face-to-face meeting. He was hosting us in their territory, and he talked to 4 of us who were leaders of the anti-mining campaign. And he said, I have to say yes to the mining company. And of course, our initial reaction, why? It's been 11 years, and we're doing everything. You're resisting actively." And his answer was simple, because if I do not say yes, many more of my community members here will die. They risk of dying from harassment and violence. They risk of dying from hunger because we are not able to produce and hunt inside the forest anymore. And we risk dying because the typhoons and all the natural disasters are one after another are coming here. And well, I still get goosebumps now. And he was literally crying and say, "Please understand me. I remain strong in our belief in our resistance here. But every day, I cannot accept the effects to my people." At that point, it dawned on me that we had to redirect the campaign. It was not a simple case of us environmentalists and human rights defenders ensuring that the mining company is not able to come in and destroy the lives and livelihoods of people. It was a matter of allowing people to be so empowered and so enabled that on their own, they will resist simply because they know that they are losing something bigger than just allowing the mining company to enter. And so from that mistake, from the 6 year of our campaign, we said we do not empower people just to be able to verbalize and articulate their opposition. We empower communities because they are defending their lives, the water, the food, and the health of their community. So it's not ATM simply providing an anti-mining campaign. It's our alliance making sure that they have access to land, they have livelihoods, they have strong health and social safety nets. It doesn't have to be our work. It is not our work as an environmental campaign, but it is our obligation to make sure that government and other organizations and other institutions provide this service to them. So I think this is one way to address the echo chambers and the silos and the fragmentation of our resistance. We have to make sure that other forms and that other tracks of community empowerment feed in, whether it's climate justice, whether it's human rights, whether it's economic empowerment. Individuals and communities will not die for challenging disaster capitalism. I'm sorry, Terry, not to reduce the importance of Naomi Klein's concept, but indigenous communities will die to protect their land. They will die and stand up to protect the water and the health of their community. We have to make sure that they have the ability to defend and nurture these things, and then we relate it to national and international solidarity concepts. If we fail on this basic step, that they are defending their own natural resources and lives with this campaign, then it is going to be very difficult for us to go to that step 3 and 4 of building the solidarity for genuine democracy.
Thank you so much for that, JV. All right, so we only have 2 minutes left, so we will try our best, to answer and to read questions more quickly. But before that, I would like to acknowledge those people who are watching via YouTube and Facebook. And of course, one of the objectives of this activity is to explore solidarity, which is really something important because we do believe that there are no borders and no flags when it comes to solidarity. So I would like to read 2 questions that I think it is in connection about solidarity. The first one is from Chris Miranda. Her question is, when you see and how do you imagine what liberation looks like for your people, and what roles do international allies and partners can play in helping all of us get there? The second question will become from Charles. His question is, how do we develop real international solidarity when language barrier exists? Please, everyone, try your best to answer it quickly. Go ahead, Attorney Mackey.
Yes, I think the indicator of that is in terms of the culture of people. Of course, it should be about improving the lives of people, but I think the culture has a lot to say about it. You sing the liberation. I mean, it's in the arts and everything. I think that's the pickup and the indicator that the community or a country is liberated.
Thank you for that, Mario. Does anyone else want to answer one of those questions? Terry? You've been very quiet.
Been very quiet because I'm learning a great deal, and I think it is incumbent on us in the United States to listen after the long colonial heritage we've given the Philippines. My God, when you were, I think it was JB who or possibly Mario, was talking about the late 19th century, early 20th century history, and I was thinking of the story of a young Marine captain, Army captain named Dwight Eisenhower, who made his bones, literally speaking, in fighting the colonial wars in the early 1900s in the Philippines. I think that international solidarity is absolutely and utterly important. And all I can do is react to things that people have been saying. Denzel is precisely right about the sidelining and the marginalization of the American left, that it almost does not exist and is surprisingly, I guess, a little bit to me, not somehow reconstituting out of the rubble of what the Democrats left us with the Biden administration, setting up the genocide, setting up basically the fascist takeover that's going on. People in this country are learning what we've been dealing out for a long time. And I think that in some ways, our learning curve is going to be a lot stiffer and a lot longer. Thanks.
I think we have time for just one more question, Jar, and then I think we close out and people can give their closing comments.
Sure. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask this question. When it comes to dual power, how do we start developing food sovereignty when it comes to the individuals and the community? Is there anyone who would like to answer that?
I can make an attempt to answer some of that. I would go on to say that it's important in order to be able to build the possibility of that happening. It's important that communities develop their own governance practices and structures in order to determine how best to do that. This is why I've emphasized and uplifted some of the work around people's movement assemblies, not so much because of the ways in which they engage the current political structure, but also the ways in which they can be used for communities to be able to determine how they want to reclaim the means of production, such as land and food. And so I would say that one of the most critical pieces to doing that is for communities to organize in a way to where they're able to make self-determined decisions about things such as food sovereignty.
Okay, we just have a couple of minutes left, so I think we need to close out. Kai, is it over to you now?
Yeah. I think if there was one person that wanted to make kind of a solidarity type statement for the full panel, if you wanted to do that for the collective and make do that, I think that would be fantastic. And then we can close out. So Chris, I think Chris, maybe you should be the one if I were to select somebody. This idea of solidarity, clearly we also talked about just the building the confidence and despite of everything that we're facing, whether it's in the Philippines or Appalachian South or wherever we might be. And so I think you are the probably most relevant person maybe of the group to kind of send us off. So sorry to put you on the spot, but I just did.
Hey Kai, Chris just sent me a message. He said he's having issue with his headset right now. So
okay. Maybe if you were to be Chris in the moment, what do you think Chris would say, Ja?
Okay, I don't believe that I will be the best person to represent Chris, but when it comes to solidarity, I think of course in our framework with Chris, because we used to work in a community and we do believe that autonomy is really something important. Not only an expression of resistance against dominant culture, but building your own autonomy is a strategic action how to advance your advocacy. And autonomy is more about creating your community more sustainable and resilient by having a direct access and control to your basic necessities such as food, energy, shelter, and so on. Because I think if communities, if every household and communities have direct and control to those basic necessities, I think it will generate autonomy. And if you have autonomy, you will be not confined to the system, which is very dominant. So I think for when it comes to solidarity, those are the things that we can explore how we will exchange solidarity by building this kind of autonomy to each community.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ja. And for people that don't know, Ja was a very principal member of pulling this all together. And I want to thank you personally, Ja, for all of that work. Thank you everybody for being here, for sharing, whether it's morning or late night. I think it's been an incredible gathering. We do have the recording of this that we will put out at some point, hopefully very soon, for those that would want access to it or for those that weren't able to attend. I think we'll make one more drop of the donation link in chat for those that want to grab it before we go. But again, thank you very much for everybody. And I'm hoping some connections have been made and relationships will be built out of this versus just virtually seeing each other on a computer screen. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Maraming salamat.
Thank you.
This is just the beginning. Thank you.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.